In this 10-year anniversary edition of Nintendo Unboxed, we're going to be revisiting the Super Famicom Jr. If you're interested in seeing my original unboxing of this console, you can click the link to that video in the description of this one. So here it is, the Super Famicom Jr. This is a hardware revision for the original Super Famicom, which was released in Japan in 1990. This revision was released in Japan in 1998, which, strangely enough, that would be almost a year after the United States received their revision of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in 1997. But this is the Japanese one, and right away we can see the branding here. Junior, kind of a strange naming convention here, but I think they wanted to communicate that this hardware revision was smaller. This was already about 7 years into the lifespan of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. The N64 had already been released, but typically consoles do have a longer lifespan in Japan. So I think they wanted to capitalize on its popularity and still keep the hardware going, just in a smaller form factor and using hardware that was more inexpensive to produce. So this is the Super Famicom Jr. I really like the aesthetic of this console. They're still keeping with the four-color aesthetic here. You can kind of see the system outlined in most of those colors here. The blue isn't quite as visible around this corner. However, maybe they're using the blue letters of Junior to kind of make up for that. But I still like that kind of glowing aesthetic here. And you can see that we have the revised controller. They've removed the Super Famicom branding and replaced it with just a Nintendo logo that's etched into the plastic. We had already seen that with the redesigned NES top loader in the United States and the Famicom AV, and in the N64. They did not include the actual console name, just the Nintendo logo. And instead of using paint or silk screening, they etched all the text into the controller plastic here, which I'm guessing is a cost-saving measure. So a little bit of a difference there with the controller. Flipping the box to its different sides, we've got blue on this first long side, and then red, and green, and then finally yellow, along with the barcode for the product. And that's actually a design aesthetic we saw with the original Super Famicom packaging in Japan. One thing we're not going to see, though, in this version is styrofoam. Much like the Famicom AV, this is just a cardboard box. No styrofoam, and maybe that's because, you know, very little is included in here. What you see on the front is basically what you get. You get your Super Famicom Jr. and the controller. So that is what we would see here in the box, along with some pieces of documentation. We've got a little bit of a warning here about the AC adapter, which was a standard issue with Japanese Nintendo hardware. And then the instruction manual here for the Super Famicom Jr. Looks like some of the chapters are outlined on these little tabs here on the cover. So if we thumb through this, no color, although I don't believe the original Super Famicom manual was in color either. You got kind of a red, black, and white scheme going on here. Table about some things to do and not to do with your Super Famicom Jr. Lots of X's through things. Wow, long list of things that you don't want to be doing with the Super Famicom Jr. And then here a little bit of an illustration of the hardware itself. The top view with the cartridge slot and the reset and the power switch, and then the front view with the two controller ports. Diagram of the back with the AV out, which we'll talk about once we take a look at the actual console. That's a change that we'll see. And then the controller. How to make the connection with the controller and the AC adapter. Here it's giving instructions here about how to hook up the AV with a mono composite video cable, and then here with a stereo and composite video cable, both of which were available in Japan, but I never saw the mono one here in the United States. Something you'd have to use an adapter for to bring down the stereo to mono. And that might be what they're, let's see here, yeah, just lots of different diagrams for making the connections to various types of TVs. And also using RF, if you were still using a TV that had RF. At this point you would have had to have bought the composite to RF adapter. That was pretty common with the N64, because at that point Nintendo went with multi-AV out as their standard versus RF, and you had to buy that separately. I remember there were Christmases where people were disappointed they just got their N64 and they couldn't hook it up because they didn't have the adapter for RF. Their TV didn't have the composite video in. Looks like we've got, this might be troubleshooting. This looks like a troubleshooting table perhaps. Or maybe this is probably the troubleshooting table right here. Not sure what this would be then. Maybe just some general instructions. Continuing on with troubleshooting. See some part numbers here. And then maybe some warranty information. I think that's the kanji for Nintendo. And on the back panel of a Japanese manual, we typically have a table here where we can put the information from the store from which it was purchased. And it looks like there's a stamp there from the store as well as a telephone number. And then here there's the sticker with the serial number that should match the serial number on the bottom of the console. So I unboxed this about 10 years ago and it matched then. Let's just make sure that no glitch goblins came in those 10 years and swapped out my Super Famicom Jr. with a different one. So here it is. Flip it over to the back right away. We've got SC10040471. We have a match. So that's the bottom panel. Got the sticker here with the console information and some specs as well as a model number. And then the sticker with the serial number here. Turning it around to the side, not too much of note except for this aesthetic with kind of that scalloped edge right here. That's an aesthetic taken from the original Super Nintendo Entertainment System. I don't believe that the Japanese Super Famicom had that, but I always kind of enjoyed that. Looks like we have some venting here as well. On this front panel we've got our two controller ports. One dot for player 1, 2 dots for player 2. More of that scalloped edge. And then on the back, just two ports, the DC in and the AV out. And it's nice to see here that we do have the AV out instead of the RF, because that's a feature that was sorely lacking in the redesigned Nintendo Entertainment System top loader. But from what I understand, there is a little bit of a, not necessarily a flaw, but just it was probably a cost-saving measure. Typically on the older original model of the Super Famicom, you could output S-video and even an RGB signal. From what I understand, all of that hardware and those chips are included in this revision, but for whatever reason they're not traced on the motherboard, so they aren't connected to this port. So you have to figure out, you know, what chips, where the graphic processor is, and then trace that back out to the port here. So of course there's resources online to do that, but kind of an interesting cost-saving measure there. Just a couple of traces on the board would vastly improve the video output here on the Super Famicom Jr. But at least you did get a multi-AV out instead of RF. So then turning it around to the front here, I always really enjoyed the aesthetic of this particular console. It's very simple. I like the two-tone gray and then that nice four-color touch there with the Super Famicom logo. But like the Famicom AV and the NES top loader, there is no LED to let you know that the system is on. So you have to pay very close attention to the power switch here if it's in the on or off position, or just take a look at your TV screen and see if there's a game screen on there. So you have that physical switch and then a reset button. to reset your game. So really nice, simple, smaller aesthetic here to the Super Famicom Jr. Certainly a quintessential example of a hardware revision to save costs and reduce form factor. And of course, we're not seeing that eject button. Nintendo, beginning with the Famicom AV, decided an eject mechanism was no longer necessary. I also quite enjoy just the shape of the cartridge slot here. Of course, it's designed to accept Japanese Super Famicom games, so we'll take a look and see how that works. I've got a copy of Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, or Triforce of the Gods, and of course the console opening here for the cartridge matches this kind of beveled or rounded design for the cartridge. So very easy to insert and remove with your hand. No eject mechanism necessary. And there isn't even a cartridge lock mechanism. As we can see here, there isn't that piece of plastic that would come out when you engage the power switch to kind of lock into this slot on the cartridge. So that was no doubt another cost-saving measure. But they did keep the physical region lockout. You know, at this point in Nintendo's history, they were still doing lots of region lockouts. Back in these days, it was more a physical mechanism rather than in the software. And the way they did that is basically just by keying the cartridges here. You can see I've got the US version of A Link to the Past here. The shape of the cartridge is quite a bit different, so it will not fit in this cartridge slot. Even though the PCB boards, those connector pins, they're the exact same size. So if you could get this PCB to interface with the cartridge slot, the game would run. There's no software lockout for Super Famicom or Super Nintendo Entertainment System. It was all a physical lockout. So if you wanted to, you know, open up the cartridges using a game bit and just swap out the PCBs, you could play those games. That wasn't the case, of course, with NES and Famicom games, because the PCB board was quite a bit shorter on the Famicom version. So we can see here we've got Rad Racer and Highway Star for Famicom and Nintendo Entertainment System. You can see how much shorter the Famicom board is than the NES board. And the reason for the additional pins on the NES game was for that 10NES piracy chip there. It's a 10NES lockout chip, so pirated games could not be made. I think piracy was more of an issue in Japan, especially with the disk system. It was a lot easier to make pirated copies of games. So Nintendo of America wanted to be sure that they had more of a control over pirated games. So quite a bit of a physical difference there with that 10NES chip. But ironically enough, it would be that 10NES chip that would be a contributing factor to all those loading issues with the original Nintendo Entertainment System hardware. Continuing on in our unboxing here, not too much left in the box except for you can see the controller peeking through this little hole here. Just one controller. That would be a bit of a change with the Famicom AV revision for the original Famicom. You got two controllers. In the United States, we only got one with the NES top loader, and here we're only going to get one as well. So this is the redesigned Super Famicom controller. Really not too much of a difference between it and its United States counterpart that we will see with the redesigned Super Nintendo Entertainment System. One of the main differences is the color of plastic. This is a little bit more of a, I don't know, yellowish gray. And I don't mean yellowed because the plastic is yellowed. I say yellowed because, well, I think that's kind of the tinge it has. The Super Nintendo Entertainment System 2 controller is going to have kind of a light, very, very light purple or lavender tinge to it to kind of match its buttons. So you'll see you can see a comparison of the two controllers in my unboxing video for the redesigned Super Nintendo Entertainment System. But in addition to that very minor difference, we've got the 4 colored buttons, which I really like. The Super Nintendo Entertainment System in the United States had concave Y and X buttons and convex B and A buttons. That wasn't the case here in the Japanese version. They were all convex buttons. So that's a bit of a regional difference here, not necessarily a difference between this hardware revision and the original. One revision difference, though, we'll see is the L and R buttons. Their labels are not printed in paint or a silk screen or whatever they would use to do that. They're kind of etched into the plastic here. And we would actually see that with some of the original Super Famicom controllers as well. The length of the controller cord seems to be a bit longer than the original Super Famicom, so that's kind of nice. Got just a little bit more of length in your cord, so you could sit farther back from your TV. And then the final difference here, you can see a complete unification in branding here. We've got just plain old controller, not Super Famicom, not Super Nintendo Entertainment System, but logos for both of those regional variations are included. So Nintendo's taking that step there to unify their branding in their consoles. So there you have the Super Famicom Jr. I hope you enjoyed this video, and will stay tuned to World of Nintendo for lots more videos just like it, especially my 10-year anniversary of the Nintendo Unboxed series, in which I'm reshooting several of my older unboxing videos in an attempt to improve the video quality a bit. So the calendar for those releases has been on the screen, and I hope you'll stay tuned for those as well as all of the other content that I'll have for you on the channel. Until then, take care.